What's critically important is what the president, I believe, that the president needs to do, and I have communicated this, what the president and the White House should do in order to make sure that we win in November. And that is making sure that we pivot and working and increasingly commit to the issues that are critically important to working people across this country. How are we going to expand Medicare? How are we going to expand Social Security? How are we going to provide relief to people's rent and mortgages? And if we can do that and continue our work on student loans, secure a ceasefire, and bring those dollars back into investing in public policy, then that's how we win in November. That's what I'm committed to, and that's what I want to make sure that we secure.
Leading off our discussion tonight is Democratic Congressman Maxwell Frost of Florida. He's a National Advisory Board member for the Biden-Harris campaign. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Congressman. Donald Trump is campaigning in your state of Florida tonight, and one of the things he said, which I'm going to ask you to translate for me, maybe you understand what he says better than I do. He said, on day one, we will throw out Bidenomics and replace it with Meganomics. We will quickly build the greatest economy in the history of the world. What do you think that's going to mean?
Well, I don't think he knows what it means, right, Lawrence. And here's the thing: whenever Trump is talking about Maganomics or whatever the new word of the day is for him that he's made up, we got to be honest about what he's talking about. There is an agenda that has been set. There is a plan that has been set by people who worked for him at the highest levels when he was in the White House. And that plan is called Project 2025. And I think, Trump has seen the polls and seen the numbers and the fact that most of the American public don't want to slip into this neo-fascism and authoritarian state that Trump wants. And so now he's coming online saying, oh, he doesn't know anything about Project 2025 when some of his top advisors are the ones that made it up and put it together. And so I encourage people to look into this, because no matter what he says on these rally stages, and by the way, I watched the rally today, it was really hard to watch. It was really hard to get through. I think he has a bank of 20 phrases, and he just throws them out randomly and sees if he gets claps. And unfortunately, a lot of the folks in that crowd will clap to anything. But Trump doesn't have an economic plan for us. What he wants to do is he wants to raise taxes on the middle class and on the poor, to give tax breaks to the rich, which is himself. He wants to roll back a lot of the amazing laws and bills that the Democratic Congress passed and that Joe Biden signed into law, and he wants to bring us backwards. And that's what everybody needs to know as we go into this election in November.
And he does want to put a 10% sales tax on everything that's imported into this country. It's a tariff, of course, but what he doesn't tell his audiences, and I don't think he understands or they understands, they pay it. It raises prices to them by 10%. So your $30,000 Toyota, say, becomes a $33,000 Toyota.
Yeah, I mean, he's just completely lying to people. And the thing here is his platform is out there. And so what we have to do as Democrats is make sure that our conversation and most of what we talk about has to be around correcting Donald Trump's lies that he will continue to tell on the campaign trail, on the debate stage, anywhere he is. The platform is out there. It's incredibly unpopular. It is not popular in the state of Florida. It is not popular in any state. And we just got to make sure we continue to talk about it. And that's something we've been doing, Lawrence, in Central Florida. We're actually in a program called Democracy Summer that Jamie Raskin started. It's students across the entire country learning about democracy and organizing and actually going out, knocking doors, going on the campaign trail. And we've hired around 20 young students, most of them high schoolers, who have learned a lot about Project 2025, who are out talking with our constituents about it. And so if you want to learn more about the program, you go to frostforcongress.com to learn about it, or chip in to help us continue to do it. But this is what we need. We need to continue to be on the doors, on our news networks, doing rallies, doing events, meeting people where they're at, and talking about the true Republican agenda, which is Project 2025.
Congressman Maxwell Frost, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
In Europe, Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine continues, and Putin wants nothing less than Ukraine's total subjugation, to end Ukraine's democracy, to destroy Ukraine's culture, and to wipe Ukraine off the map. And we know Putin won't stop at Ukraine. But make no mistake, Ukraine can and will stop Putin.
Joining us now is Admiral John Kirby, White House National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications. Admiral Kirby, thank you very much for joining us on this important night. We heard a lot of, it sounded like unanimous agreement among the NATO members there, the heads of state representing all those countries, 32 countries, when the president said things like that about Ukraine tonight. Is that the reality within the NATO of all that kind of unity?
Yes, I would say I'd go so far, Lawrence, as to say that NATO is more unified and more resolved, certainly more relevant than it's ever been before. And I had a long career in the military myself, 30 years or so in the Navy. I've never seen the alliance as strong and as determined as it is now. That's not by accident. That's by President Biden's leadership and really investing in alliances and partnerships. Certainly, it's an outgrowth of what Mr. Putin has tried to do in Ukraine. NATO is resolved and NATO is determined. And what you're going to see this week is a series of deliverables, tangible deliverables, for the alliance to make good on its commitments to helping Ukraine defend itself.
To what extent is this the performance, the outward performance of a set of agreements pre-negotiated by staff and by the leaders over the weeks and months leading up to this meeting, and how much new might actually be accomplished in real time at the meeting?
Every conference like this, as you can imagine, there's staff that works it and prepares it and gets ready for the major deliverables and the announcements. That's no different here, no question about it. But I think, including starting tonight, we have seen, and you will see over the next couple of days, real tangible deliverables. One of the example tonight, for instance, is air defense. The president and leaders across the alliance have announced additional air defense capabilities for Ukraine. In the short term, strategic air defense systems like the Patriots and additional Patriot systems going to Ukraine. In the near term, in the near to mid-term, more mid-range air defense systems will be made. Tactical air defense systems will be made available to Ukraine. Over the coming days, you'll also see announcements about the F-16s and when they're going to get to Ukraine and how Ukraine will be able to use them. You're going to see a reaffirmation of NATO being in Ukraine's future, eventual membership, and what that looks like, the path to membership in NATO. All of that will come out of this week.
NATO was obviously created as a umbrella defense of Europe. That's its purpose, that's its focus, that's its job. Not all of these countries see the situation in Israel the same way. They don't see the war in Gaza the same way. Does that, to the extent that there are disagreements, how does that impact the way NATO is working and the issues they are working on within NATO?
It won't affect the summit, and it certainly won't affect the larger issues before the alliance right now, which is clearly the main issue is Russia's war in Ukraine. But there's also issues that they're going to talk about over the next couple of days about defense industrial base development and investment, not just in the United States, but in their countries as well, and in making sure that Ukraine also has an effective, resilient defense industrial base going forward. So there's lots of issues that they'll be able to talk about and tackle. I don't expect the situation in the Middle East to be a dominant topic of discussion. It's not a separate agenda. I mean, you're right, Lawrence. Not everybody agrees with what's going on there. All I can do is speak for President Biden, and he's made it clear we got to make sure Israel can defend itself. We also got to make sure that the people of Gaza don't suffer any more needless suffering than they already have as a result of this war that Hamas has started.
The president has obviously been reaching out to leading Democrats, Democrat organizations, Congressional Black Caucus, to say publicly, I am a candidate, I'm remaining a candidate, I'm going to run for re-election, I'm going to serve another term. Is he doing something similar with NATO to try to assure NATO that he is indeed staying in this campaign?
He's not going to focus on his domestic political situation in this summit. That's not the agenda, and frankly, that shouldn't be the focus of the conversations over the next couple of days. He made it clear publicly. He certainly, as you rightly said, made it clear privately to supporters and to the Democratic National Committee that he's in and he's not leaving and he's running for re-election. I think that's fairly obvious, and that will be fairly obvious, obviously, to the foreign leaders that are here in Washington this week. I can tell you, because I've been in the room when they've talked to him, they appreciate his leadership. They appreciate what he's done on the world stage. They very much appreciate his leadership and American leadership on the NATO alliance and the difference that it has made, not just in supporting Ukraine, but in really trying to build out and develop the NATO alliance for the next 75 years.
Let's listen to one of the questions that was asked in the White House press briefing yesterday, a briefing you participated in. This was after you left. Let's listen to this.
Say that the Pentagon at some point picks up an incoming nuke. It's 11 p.m. Who do you call? The First Lady?
Now, that's the kind of nonsense that Karine Jean-Pierre had to deal with yesterday. I know you were uncomfortable getting questions from the press about the president's condition because that's become something of a campaign issue, and campaign issues is not what you talk about. But to frame it in the terms that we just heard, on the question of force readiness and the commander-in-chief's readiness within that force, at the top of that force. What should America know about President Biden's ability to process emergency information of a national defense, national security issue over the 24-hour time period of a day?
That he can do it, and he has done it. I've been with him, Lawrence. I've seen him at all hours of the day and night as he has processed incoming information, probing for more, asking his national security team to provide additional context, convening world leaders almost on a snap notice. I've seen that as well, particularly with Ukraine. He knows. He knows better than most because he's been at this business for so long, and also 8 years as vice president, that the job of commander-in-chief is a 24/7 hour job. I mean, there is no break, and he understands that. And the answer to the question that Karine got is simple. You call the president, and that's what the national security team does. They call the president.
Yeah, there's nothing, most of the rest of the government does not involve the possibility of emergency. National security does involve the possibility of emergency. No one from Social Security is trying to run into the president at 2 o'clock in the morning and say we have an emergency, or in fact, most of what the government does. And so your engagement in your entire career has been in national security. It remains that today in the White House. And so your perspective on this president's ability to handle the unexpected at the unexpected hour, I think, is very important for people to be able to hear. And so is there anything that you can think of that in any way restricts this president's ability to handle the potential emergency aspects of the job involving national security?
No, sir. Not a whit. Not a single whit. No, sir. I have seen him, again, all hours of the day and night, processing information of an emergent nature, probing and asking the right questions. And the thing that has impressed me the most, and I didn't know the president before I took this job 2.5 years ago. We had never met. What has really impressed me, including in the last couple of days as we've been working towards the preparations for the NATO summit, is how much he draws on his own keen sense of history and the relationships that he has forged over a long career in public service with overseas leaders. He knows them. And if they're new leaders, he makes an effort to get to know them. He really believes that diplomacy needs to be personal as well as policy driven. And he acts on that. And he has a fine sense of the way leaders behave and the way countries sort of move and the direction that they want to go in, all drawn on a long career in public service. And I'll go one more. Again, because I have such a broad experience in national security. At a time like now, the president calls it an inflection point. At a time right now where there's a war in Ukraine, there's a war in Gaza. We've got significant tensions in the Indo-Pacific, largely because of the belligerent actions of the PRC. And I could go on and on. Counterterrorism, counter-narcotics. There's a lot going on in the world. You want somebody who has that breadth of experience and the wisdom that comes from that experience. And then, just as critically, the ability to forge and to sustain the kinds of relationships with the overseas leaders that actually gets things done. And that's what he's done for the last 3.5 years.
Admiral John Kirby, thank you very much for giving us some of your time tonight.
Thank you, sir.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.